Hello, and welcome to My Pastor, and Me, a podcast examining the latest and greatest in New Church community. My name is Ragnar Kagi, and with me today is Scott Frazier, head of the theological school over at Bernathen College. Today we're going to be covering plenty of church-related topics, but first, tell us a little bit about yourself, Scott.
Ragnar, first of all, thanks for inviting me. I want to correct the record a little bit. I am Scott Frazier. I'm the incoming dean of the theological school. Andy Dibb is still the dean, at least for a couple months. And before that, I was and am currently a professor over at Bernathen College of the New Church. I have been teaching there for about 27 years. I was ordained into the priesthood of the General Church in 2006, and then given the blue stole a year later in 2007.
Awesome. Okay, so you're a pastor. I want to know when/how did you know that being a pastor was your calling?
Yeah, that there's a shorter answer and a slightly longer answer. The shorter answer is first sophomore year of high school, but for the wrong reasons, and then freshman year of college for slightly better reasons, sophomore year of college for scary reasons, and then senior year of college, I think, for the right reasons.
Okay, you want to walk me
Let
through
me
it?
go through that. Sophomore year of high school, I had a religion course here at the academy and had lots of discussions with the priest there and wasn't entirely pleased with what he was saying. Maybe you've met some high school sophomores, right? Can be a cantankerous bunch. And that was the first time I thought, man, I could explain this stuff better. Maybe that's what I want to do. And at the time, I decided I wanted to be a writer and influence the world, as writers do. But that was the first niggling thought that maybe I should try and explain the doctrines because I cared a lot about them and I didn't like the way it occurred when I was a sophomore. Now, a note, I have since apologized to my sophomore high school religion teacher for how terribly I treated him. And when I
Oh,
did,
really?
he laughed. He had some vague memory of my behavior, but nothing really stuck. So I thought it was a big deal, but he did not. So then, fast forward to college. I'm at what is now Bernathen College of the New Church across the street, and I'm loving my Divine Love and Wisdom class with Prescott Rogers. And I'm thinking, oh, I would love a job where I just talk about this all day and where I could translate, because I love translating Latin to English. And I thought, oh, it'd be cool if I could, be a translator. I didn't really want to be a pastor or anything, and go out in the field and preach in a cathedral or something like that. That sounded scary. But the idea of being in a classroom and talking about these ideas where people had to listen, well, hey, that sounds great. And then as a sophomore in college, I had a Latin class with the Reverend Bruce Rogers, and I mentioned I wanted to be a translator. And he kind of looked at me and he said, well, you do realize that translators have to be priests.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Neither did I. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, whose words do you think they're saying from the lectern?
Right. Wait, so how much of what you're saying from the lectern is your translation versus Potts?
Well, that's a great question. I think when it comes to most translations, and I don't know about other priests, Old and New Testament, mostly you go with what you've got. But if you're focusing on a text,
Hmm.
oh, you definitely look under the hood there. You look at the Latin, and I always retranslate my Heavenly Doctrine passage when I preach.
Cool. I
So,
didn't know that
yeah,
you can't always rely on accepted translations and
rely is a
everything.
good word for that. You could probably rely on it, but there is something about being in the space and knowing the audience and knowing how it's going to come across. So,
Right. Well, also it's a completely different experience reading the doctrine in Latin versus reading it in English. And
yes.
quite often, as you get better at reading it in Latin, it starts to mean different things than when you just read it in English.
Absolutely. And so that's what you got to bring when you look at it and then when you tweak it and read it, say in a church service, you've always got to be careful though, because if it sounds too different from what people are used to, they get distracted.
Oh, have you ever run into that where someone has come up to you after service saying, "Hey, that's not what it
Yeah.
says."
Well, they're usually not quite so brazen. They often, three times at least, they've said, well, that was an interesting translation. Which translation was that?
Oh, and you have to say the Scott Frazier
That was my
translation.
translation. And once it was awkward, and they said, "Oh, okay."
Oh,
Awkward silence.
right.
Yeah, that was a former professor of mine who said that.
So do you often run into criticisms of your sermons after giving them? Or is it like everyone wants to be polite, but it's
That's
underhanded
a great,
jabs?
great question. It's hard to get effective feedback,
Okay.
and that usually means negative feedback. Because if people say, "Oh, I liked your sermon; it was great," that's nice, but it
Gee,
doesn't tell me
thanks.
doesn't tell me anything to change for next time.
Sure.
So I developed some ways to figure it out. I like a little scoring system. I would often check to see who was there, whose opinion I might trust, like a theologue.
Mhm.
I even went so far as to wearing a notable tie. And then after church, if everyone wants to say, "Ooh, neat tie," that means they don't want to talk about the sermon.
Interesting.
So it's hard to get people to criticize your sermon, and it's even harder to get them to criticize it constructively.
Gotcha. So sort of off of that, I didn't know that you have to translate your own passages. What else do people not really understand about
Mm,
being in the priesthood, giving sermons, and other roles that pastors have to fill? I know
that's a
you
great
you like
question.
you marry people.
Yes, that's fun. Now, not first of all, not all priests have to do translations.
Okay.
I mean, you're able to. That's great. Something surprising is how little influence you really have. Because it
Mm.
looks like, especially the public parts of the job, that you're up there telling it like it is. Or if you're in a classroom, you decide what things mean. But the reality is, you're often speaking in a scenario where people can take it or leave it. And
Right.
we've all had the experience of being in church and thinking, what was church about? Oh, I don't remember.
It's most Sundays for me.
Yeah, well,
Most Wednesdays after the Sunday. We'll put it
sure,
that way.
yes. Remembering it after a couple days is hard. So there are people who think that priests are influential, and they are, but maybe not in the way they think.
Mm.
They are not necessarily believed blindly.
Sure.
Now, my job's a little different because I've never been a field pastor running a
Mm.
society, and so I preach normal Sunday stuff very rarely.
Right.
I think what people don't realize about the job out there, although you'll have to ask them, is how much executive function and discipline it takes to run your week.
Oh, okay.
Now, in like a high school setting, you guys are institutionalized.
Right.
So you know what you're supposed to be doing, like by the minute during your work week.
Yeah.
But what if somebody said, write me a 5-page paper you would stand by for the next 10 years, have it done in a week?
Oh, brother. So I guess what you're saying is that field pastors sort of have to figure out how to fill their week. I've never really thought about that. What do pastors who aren't a part of the broader priesthood here, or I guess they are part of the broader priesthood, but they're not or surrounded by priests or
Yeah, they're
doing
not
stuff
in
like
this odd
that.
place. Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's fun. They have a lot of odd little things around the edges. Some of them not so little.
Consultation, I
They
imagine.
visit people. They do all the little bits of administrative work that go with maybe managing a building or
Mm.
organizing the services. They can travel. They reach out to people through email and letters and phone calls. There are 1,000 weird little problems. People say, well, maybe I'll talk to a minister. And
Oh,
furthermore,
okay.
you don't pick when they pick up the phone.
So you're just on call all the time.
On call is a great way to put it. The joke is that, oh, being a minister must be so easy. You work what, 2 hours on a Sunday? Ah. But one of the challenges of being a pastor is you don't know what success looks like on a Wednesday.
Right.
I imagine in your world, success looks like passing the test or not getting too much homework. Doom, 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 doom. You know what you're doing on a Wednesday. If you survive, you win. Could you wake up on a Wednesday and attend to long term tasks usefully?
Sure. I mean, I probably could eventually.
It takes practice.
Yeah, right. Um, so off of that, how much time are you spending when you're giving service on Sunday? How much time do you spend making your
Great.
sermon?
Yeah.
And is it different if you're really invested in the topic or if it's like I don't know what to do. I'm just gonna.
I've never gotten the process down to something smooth.
Mm,
I imagine if you're a Jeremy Simmons or a Malcolm Smith, you've got it down. But for me, it's at least 10 hours.
10 hours. Wow.
And for me, the process is often I get a fun idea that I think is too fun, and I develop it and I research it and I start writing a rough draft of it, and then I realize that I am making the text say something it doesn't.
Uh,
And then I scrap that
right.
and I have to start over. Hopefully, my rough draft is done by the Thursday,
Okay.
and then I let it sit for a day, and then I come back to it Friday, tighten it up, and then I start pacing around the house, mumbling it as the patient family members leave me be. And then I usually go to the cathedral or wherever on a Saturday and stand up there and read it through a couple times. And then there's this point where I realize I don't have time to change it anymore, and that's when it's done.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like what I was doing when I practiced for the oratoricals.
Yes, I've seen someone else do that. It was a very similar process.
So you spend about 10 hours. Do you try and dedicate days to it, or is it like rough draft, leave it for a bit, rough draft, leave it for a bit, work
Uh,
on it?
it has to be that latter way, unless something goes wrong.
Okay.
Because I believe strongly in the different states. You look at something one day, it's different. So if I did those 10 hours, say 2 p.m. to 2 a.m. Saturday, it wouldn't work.
Right.
You've got to build stuff on Tuesday, let it be. See it and write it maybe Thursday, let it be. Think it's terrible, but you've got to change it. All of those kinds of things.
Right. And you, from what I know of you, you have a lot of doctrine on demand and floating around inside your head. How much of your sermon writing is you researching the text, and how much of it is I already know what passages talk about this. I don't really need to go
Ooh,
find it. I just need to make sure I'm not misrepresenting it.
that's a that's a fun demarcation. I think it's shifted a little bit over the years. I do a little bit maybe less research,
Hmm.
but it starts almost always with a story or a law or something from the Old or New Testament
Okay.
that I think is cool. And then I go research it, and maybe I find out it's cool in the way I thought, or maybe I don't.
Right.
But it has always been new research.
Okay. So
Yeah.
So when you find something that isn't cool in the way you thought, is that referencing sort of sensitive topics that you should stay away from?
No, it's a little counterintuitive. This might also be
Uh,
a surprising thing. When you find a story and you think you know what it means, and it's going to be the snappy, no one's ever thought of that before.
the perfect piece to the perfect puzzle.
Yes, and then you realize the reason no one's thought of it before is because it's not true. Um,
I've definitely run into that in
yeah.
debates where it's like, oh, this is what it says. Go and I look it up and it's like, that was completely out of context. It doesn't mean that.
Yes. So I have in my files a failed sermon
Mm,
from I think it was April of 2020, maybe March, where I thought the story of Saul meeting the witch of Endor was really going to tell us a lot about the way we encounter culture versus the word.
okay.
And I was pretty sure I knew where it was going.
Yeah.
And the more I researched, it just refused to come together. And it ran counter to what I thought. And I could feel myself trying to force it to mean something it did not. And that
Right.
sermon was never finished. Still
Well,
don't know what it means.
yeah, and you run into that specifically writing papers where you develop your
Absolutely.
thesis and then you try and find sources to back it up. Do you develop your sermon's point before you go looking in the text, or is it like, I want to preach about how you should love your neighbor. I'm gonna go find passages about love your neighbor. Obviously, that's
Yeah. In integrity, you're never supposed to decide what the text means before you listen carefully to it.
mm,
That's an ideal, and I try and stick to that. So instead, it'll be something like um, the story of Deborah, Barak, and Jael or Yael. What is that?
sure.
And then you can just listen and hopefully something starts to come to you. Oh, interesting. And there are principles of exposition that we're trained as priests to go looking into. What's the first thing said, last thing? What's the emotion? Are there orders in it? Look for threes. Are the place names significant? All this kind of stuff.
Okay.
And then hopefully something just kind of comes out of that. You're listening appropriately, but each sermon is a guess.
Interesting. So it starts out as a guess, and you finish fairly confident that you know what it means. Do you ever run into a sermon? If you ran into a sermon where you didn't absolutely know what message you were spreading, is that something you would just not give that Sunday and you would have to fold?
Well, that's a great question. Part of the luxury I have is that I get weeks of lead up for a sermon
Right.
because I got a day job.
Yeah.
I don't know how the Derek Elphicks or like the David Ross do it, where they got to crank it out 3 times a month, 4 times a month.
Right.
I will tell you that there is a sermon I preached that, in retrospect, I think I would do differently now. I mean, like a specific sermon. I know what I would say differently now.
And it was like broad strokes meaning, or it was I got this little part wrong, but the
No, no, I broad strokes.
oh wow.
So then what do? Do I send people a letter correcting a sermon I
Dear New
gave?
Church community,
Yeah.
I was wrong.
But even there, you got to have the humility to know that doesn't mean I'm right now.
Right.
And so that's also a surprising thing about being a priest. Different than a speech. A speech can be about you.
Yeah.
It can be about getting attention. But a sermon is supposed to be more that you're a window onto the inner meaning of the word. You
Right.
got to
You're
get out of the way.
explaining something objective, whereas a speech can be I'm talking about something I want to talk about.
Exactly. So one of the things we learn in writing sermons is be careful of that wonderful turn of phrase you love so much.
I
You
think.
probably have to get rid of, well, whatever it is. Like you get a pithy little phrase or a nice little bumper sticker thought. Look out,
Oh
that may be
man.
you.
So is there some kind of satisfaction when you go back to the doctrines and you understand what it was saying better than you did before? Or is it a little bit of bittersweet, as in, like, oh, I led people astray. What am I supposed to do about this?
Yeah. Um, there's a big issue in when you preach, because you do all of this studying, you try and figure out what the doctrines say, and then when you preach it, you can come back to it later and realize, oh, there's a lot there I didn't get to, or I could have put it differently, or I could have put it better. But another big issue is what people actually hear. So the first sermon I gave in Kempton was on the nakedness of Noah. When he gets drunk, it's this crazy little story. And then I came out into the little hall to hear what people thought, kind of nervous, you can imagine. And these two ladies came up to tell me how much they loved it. You know, they're being very polite. But the first woman said, "Oh, I loved how you gave us a sermon about how there really are problems in the church, and we have to admit that there are problems in the church." Fair enough. But the other lady standing there, she kind of gasped and said, "No, no, we just got a sermon about how we need to not focus on the problems in the church, and about how we have to acknowledge that while it's never going to be perfect, there's no point in obsessing about all the problems in the church."
Sure. Okay. So, in that example, I'm not gonna ask who was right, but do you have an answer for, like, in your mind, who you were preaching to and what message you were trying to preach? Or is it really, oh, you throw an idea up there and whatever sticks to the inside of people's brains?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of you just throw out ideas out there and hope something sticks, because that implies that you're not trying to do something specific.
Right.
In this particular case, I think the woman who said we should not focus on the problems may have had the slightly better argument,
Mhm.
because the first woman was responding to the first third of the sermon,
Okay.
and the second woman was responding to like the end of the sermon. And it's this nuanced point I was trying to make about how you have to account for problems but not focus upon them. And it's this image of his sons walking backwards with a cloak. It's this fun image. But what I got from this is people are going to hear really different things when you preach, and you can't control what people hear. And anybody who gives a speech or any sort of public presentation has to grapple with this lost in translation phenomenon.
Right. And a sort of a point that feeds into that, especially with our religion, is the doctrine of your own understanding,
Absolutely.
which I think sometimes people try to use as an excuse to uh, do what you want kind of thing. Or I think it's dangerous to say that in the context of I'm doing something and I want to try and justify it with the doctrine.
Mhm.
How does doctrine of understanding, how do you interpret that? And how should people safely go about quoting that? Because I know a lot of the times when people quote that at me, I sort of give them
You
a bit of a
wistful?
side glance,
Yeah,
like, how are you using that? Because
that's a great question. This is also one of the major themes of the college course I teach every fall
uh,
to sort of like it's a boot camp course for freshmen and about the formation of doctrine or so how do you read the word and get instructions from it and how do you know they're the right instructions?
right,
And you were tilting a little bit to what's the correct way to read it. And one of the things I'd point out in that class is if you read the word as if you have finally gotten to the top of the mountain and are talking to the wisest person in the world, you listen.
mhm,
But if you read the word as a teenager, reading the instructions their parents left for them for the weekend, that's a very different attitude.
yeah,
Are you reading the word trying to figure out what it wants you to do, or are you reading the word looking for loopholes and technicalities and stuff like that?
sure,
And it's always fun to dunk on teenagers, but the reality is everybody does the one or the other depending on the day.
sure,
And you should listen rather than seek loopholes and technicalities. Now, to your bigger, broader question, there's this interesting tension between the literal sense of the word, which can be pretty crazy, and then what we think it says. And that's really what doctrine is. So if you read a story and you tell somebody, hey, I think this story is about, not lying, that's your doctrine of the story,
sure,
lowercase d.
yeah,
So, for example, when we read the book New Jerusalem and its Heavenly Doctrine, capital D, that is the writings telling us what the stories mean.
sure,
So we've got this really interesting system where you go to the literal sense and you're supposed to get your doctrine from it. But you can't get doctrine from the literal sense until somebody has already told you what it means.
yeah,
But once someone's told you what it means, then when you go to the literal sense, you can say, oh, I can see that, but I'm seeing it a little differently. So
right,
we get this almost like a two-stroke engine where now you know what it means, you can see more in it. And when you can see more in it, now you know what it really means.
yeah,
And
gotcha.
now you can see more in it. And so it's constantly tuning and tightening up, which is why when we argue about this, we have to argue from the words on the page rather than just some vibe.
Right, and that gets deeper. Which words on the page are you using? Which
Absolutely.
translation are you going to use?
Oh, yeah.
That's why everyone should learn Latin.
Well, do we want everybody being that dangerous?
It's a good point.
Maybe not.
Not as dangerous as me.
Yes. But we do actually, the church does need both priests and lay people who know enough Latin to be dangerous. So they can say, wait a second, that's not what it says.
Well, and you sort of get a bit of that, at least with our Sunday brunches, where a lot of the people in that room know a fair bit of Latin, or at least
Enough to be
pretend they know.
dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah, enough to be dangerous, and it makes for a really good time. But I want to quickly switch avenues right now. We are in a very unique religion and position to where we're pretty much integrated into the Philadelphia area.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of interaction with people outside of the Philadelphia area because of how integrated we are. Um, and oftentimes when I'm playing sports or when I'm interacting with other schools and people ask about what Academy of the New Church, what is that? What does that mean?
Oh, yeah.
What is the new church? I really don't know what to tell them because I could come off strong like, oh, second coming already happened. It's these
Boom.
books, bam, and that'll shut people down. I'll get some sideways glances, and probably that's more faithful to what it actually is. How do you go about explaining to people what we're doing here and what the doctrine of the new church says without
Great
trying to
question.
without trying to get people to shut down and not listen to what you're saying.
Absolutely. There is the shutdown answer where you want them to go away. Maybe not the nicest, but we can
Right.
imagine. So then our first question is, are you trying to give them a postcard or are you trying to have a conversation? So for example, if they just want an answer they can then report later, it has to have a beginning and an end and make sense without you being there. That's like a postcard. Or are you going to have a conversation because you're going to connect with this person maybe more than once and have a friendship? Let's attend to the postcard first. And I hear you on the going strong, but mostly when people want to know what's your religion about, they want to know why do you care about it or what do you love about it?
Sure.
So there's not going to be a right answer. And some people are going to say, oh, we in the new church think that everybody can go to heaven and it's not about your denomination. True. You can say, we believe the second coming has already happened. Also true. You can say a lot of different answers about what your church is, but mostly what people want to know is, what is your religion? They don't want some official answer. They're like,
Sure.
so who are you? And we could wax philosophic about identity and meaning and happiness, but for that postcard, they just want to know what you like about it.
Yeah.
And everyone's going to have different answers. If we dig a little bit more in, you can open with questions like, well, so what do you think? Do you have a background? And depending on that, I have a slightly tongue-in-cheek profile I offer as a functional definition of our religion.
Okay.
So this isn't what you tell people. These are sort of the tools.
Sure.
If you study other religions, generalizations, of course, exceptions, blah, blah, blah. But if you study other religions, I think it's fair to say we are monotheistic like Judaism. There is one God, and we are radically monotheistic.
Yeah.
Jesus is Jehovah. My brother had that as a bumper sticker in Texas. I think he got looks because that is not official Christian doctrine.
Is it not?
No, Jesus is not Jehovah in official Christian doctrine.
Okay.
So you can say, well, we think Jesus is Jehovah. Is that a boom? Who knows? We're monotheistic like Judaism. We say sorry like a Catholic. We think you have to say sorry and stop doing the bad thing.
Yeah.
Which is official Catholic doctrine about repentance and penitence and all of this stuff. We're right there with them on that. So if they have a background in that, okay, I get that. And then you can say, and we care about what's written in the word like a Protestant, because they love slinging those passages around and say, but it says here, but it says there. And we are also, in a good way, kind of obsessed with that literal sense and figuring out what it means.
Right.
So depending on who you're talking to, there's something you can connect to. The last thing I want to say on that is these are positive descriptions.
Yeah.
If you're talking to somebody who's had just a few too many philosophy classes, maybe you want to go to a more distinct impression. And that's when you do things like, we think the second coming's already happened. We reject a trinity of persons, and you can start getting into terminology.
Right.
I don't recommend that as a first pass.
I found it to be bad strategy.
Yeah, that doesn't really work. Mostly they want to know what you like about it. And so everyone's going to have a different answer.
Yeah, I try to stick to that. And sometimes I point out, at least within the community, that it's a very academic community. People,
This community is.
at least here, it's very scholarly and just a huge concentration of people who know their stuff. That's what I usually start out with. It's like, oh, it's a scholarly Christian organization. And then if they try and dig a little deeper, I'll break out the more sensitive stuff.
Now, I guess that happens when you are at a school too.
Right.
Because if you go to the general church in other places, and I don't want to try and paint another community as non-scholarly, there are a lot of other flavors out there.
Right.
But in a town with 3 to 4 to 5 schools, scholarly is going to be an adjective that applies.
For sure. So I think one of my favorite parts of teaching, or not teaching people, telling people about the new church is occasionally you get the people who are really interested
Yeah.
and are like, you've told them all of the nitty-gritty stuff that they might get shied away from, and they want to learn more. What book do you recommend they start with? There's a lot of different options, and some of the stuff can get pretty raunchy's the wrong word, but pretty
Bold,
yeah,
aggressive.
pretty bold and aggressive
Yeah.
very quickly. So what's a nice way to ease them into not only the content but reading Swedenborg? Because the more like you read Swedenborg, you start out, you're not getting anything.
It's like
Oh.
throwing spaghetti at a wall.
Okay, so you've almost asked a translation question, and I'm going to resist the temptation to doing a deep dive on whether you keep grammar, inflection, sentence structure, tone in a translation. We're not going to do that. We could.
Okay.
In terms of content, though, again, it's about audience, and traditionally, the book Heaven and Hell is the one that's easiest to get into because everybody has an idea that there's an afterlife,
Yeah.
but very few people have any specifics as to what the afterlife is.
Sure.
And so if you start reading Heaven and Hell, it's like, these are the heavens, and this is who belongs, and this is what life looks like. It's stuff that's easily accessible in terms of content. But that doesn't mean it's an answer for everybody. If you got somebody who's more philosophically minded and maybe doesn't have so much of a Christian background, who knows, you might start with a book like Divine Love and Wisdom, which opens with this idea. Everybody knows that love is. Nobody knows what love is. Let's talk about what love is.
Sure.
And it goes from there into topics like vesselhood and what order is and what are gradations of spiritual reality. Really heady stuff that for some people is blah. That doesn't mean anything to me. But to other people, it's what they've been looking for.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess where I was going with that is conjugal love specifically, or married love, depending on what how picky you
The
are,
whole topic.
was written and published not necessarily as a theological work, but as sort of a handbook for, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was published in London as like a handbook and not theologically under Swedenborg's name, which was rare for him to do. He usually published under a pseudonym. Uh, is that typically one that you'll recommend to people? Because the back half of that can get pretty crazy pretty quickly.
Yes.
If you're used to taking Swedenborg at face value, well, you should take it at face value, but at face value outside of context.
If you're airdropped into the back fifth of
Right.
Conjugal Love, you're going to get upset.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's a fascinating book. I like to tease my students and say there aren't any new ideas in that book. All the ideas in Conjugal Love are in Heaven and Hell, Divine Love and Wisdom, Divine Providence, Arcana Celestia, all those other texts.
Yeah,
It's just applying them to a super important topic, which is marriage,
sure.
a subset of which is human marriage. But that's a whole thing.
Right.
And you referred to the back half. I like to point out it's the back fifth. It's like 20%.
Sure.
And that book is, it's such a great, almost, not a test, but it reveals a lot about a culture. Because when you talk about the nature of God and what it is to be enlightened, nobody needs to get upset about that. You can take it or leave it.
Yeah.
But when you say, and this is how people operate,
Right.
well, that gets personal because it is. It's about the person.
Sure.
And every culture has their own issue with that book in every age and every place on earth.
Right.
So, for example, I have colleagues in South Korea who are having a hard time evangelizing. And the reason is because their friends and colleagues come to them and say, listen, the ideas in that book, Conjugal Love, are never going to fly here. As long as you keep claiming that men and women are equal, you're done.
Oh, I bet that caused a little bit of a stir.
So should they stop saying that in Korea?
No.
And then my favorite crazy example is a man comes to a priest in another part of the world and he says, I love your doctrines. I love all of these ideas. I love the book Conjugal Love or Married Love. But what do I do with my second and third wives?
Oh, brother.
I threw them out last week because now I'm monogamous, but my family's very angry with me. What should I do?
Oh, man.
This is not a problem we in suburban America often confront.
Right. So what are you supposed to do when you're, I mean, we believe that everyone can go to heaven and that all cultures can go to heaven and we leave room for culture. But what are you supposed to do if in that culture what you're doing is specifically damaging? For like my extreme example, but Aztecs and baby sacrifice.
I'll always go to Aztecs, right?
Right.
It's great. One of the few city-states that continue to do real cannibalism.
Sure.
Everybody's favorite. Well, first of all, you're not going to have a simple, straightforward answer for the interaction of culture and theology. But the way I think about it, and it works a lot of the time, is that culture is downstream, if you will, from beliefs.
Mm.
Like what we do has some connection to how we think the world works.
Right.
Not always. We all have self-destructive habits or mindless practices or things we do just to get along with other people. But the way you mix your coffee is in some way tied to what you think will make you happy.
Yeah.
And so theology is sort of the formal study of, I mentioned them before, identity, meaning, and happiness.
Yeah.
And so when you go to the word to find out the nature of identity, meaning, and happiness, and then you turn and look at your culture, theology is supposed to give you a lens to critique it. Now, critique the culture. Critiquing other people, different topic. But
Yeah.
you're supposed to look at your life and say, does my behavior align with the things I think are true? So if you're an Aztec and you're given conjugal love, and let's say in some crazy universe, you read it and you think it's awesome, and then you look at this cannibalistic city-state. Now we turn to how do you make it better? How do you feed the good in other people, which is the writing's description of loving the neighbor, feeding the good. So who knows? It's going to take 1,000 different flavors. Another way to consider this question is if you wake up tomorrow in some crazy universe and you are a camp guard at a Nazi concentration camp.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do? And I
Right.
throw this at my students, and very quickly they realize you don't quit because then someone else will just take your job.
Mhm.
But how do you love the neighbor as a concentration camp guard? What are your options? Because you do have options.
Yeah.
So whether we're talking about the Aztecs or, World War II or whatever else, the theology is about using these principles from the word and trying to tilt things better. And it almost always means you should stop doing bad stuff.
Seems like a pretty good place to wrap it up.
All
Stop
right.
doing
That sounds
bad
great.
stuff.
Stop doing bad stuff.
Well, thank you so much, Scott Frazier, for coming out and talking to us.
Oh, thanks for having me. This has
Yeah,
been
it's
fun.
been great. Have a good day.
You too.